So good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, given it has an extraordinary panel and many things to talk about in today's discussion. So I'm Jane Huckabee. I direct the International Human Rights Clinic here at Duke Law. And it's my true privilege to be able to introduce and to moderate our panel today. The panel will be exploring the opportunities and the challenges of engaging in supranational institutions like the UN to address issues of racial inequalities in America. So thinking about the ways in which, particularly within the United States, the Bringing Human Rights Home movement has really begun to look externally to different sites of advocacy to draw attention to domestic issues and why that's been occurring, and again, what some of the challenges have been in that approach. We do have, I really can't think of a better panel to talk us through these different issues. I'm going to briefly introduce each person, and what we will do for format is have each person give a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from all of you about the questions and reflections that you have on this really important issue and advocacy focus. So I'll introduce our speakers in order. So first of all, we'll be hearing from Rob Robinson, who is a senior advisor at the Partners for Dignity and Rights based in New York City. We then will hear from Jamil Daqua, who is the director of the ACLU Human Rights Program. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Gaynell Curry, who is a faculty member at the University of the Bahamas and a member of the People of African Descent, a newly established body in the UN system. And so we'll be talking about things that some of you will be familiar with and some maybe not so much. And just a quick 101, very, very quick 101 on the UN system. We'll be talking about something we call special procedures, which are a series of UN independent experts, both thematic and country mandate experts. And we're talking about how folks in the US have engaged with that process. We're talking about treaty monitoring bodies, and these are bodies that attach to each of the 9 core international human rights treaties, which take on various functions vis-a-vis states parties to those treaties, including reviewing the country record of the state in question against the treaty. So just a few, we'll do our best to explain as we go along and not to do too much acronym usage in the States, but we definitely, again, invite you to engage in the Q&A after these presentations. Given the content and the amount we have to cover, you'll see me passing a note occasionally to give our speakers a heads up that the timing is running short. And then that's really to ensure that we get to the great Q&A that I know will ensue from these presentations. So thank you again to our extraordinary panelists for being here at Duke and for all of the different activities that you're supporting. This is a hugely co-sponsored event. It's a human rights in practice event, but really has been something that students across the law school have been deeply invested in, and we really look forward to your contributions. Rob, start us off.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to all the students who are here today. I want to thank everybody at Duke for inviting us, and I want to thank my colleagues. These are 2 people. I know Jamil very well. I'm learning about Professor Curry a little bit, and I like to do my research and understand who I'm in the room with, so I'll be digging and finding out more as we go along. But I want to give a special thank you to Professor Iyer, who I knew as an intern at my human rights organization several years ago, and it's pretty neat to be in a space where she's now a professor and not the intern that I was working with, so thank you. So my name is Rob Robinson. If you've read my bio, I'm formerly homeless, and that's how I came to this work around organizing around UN mechanisms and different human rights bodies and treaty bodies. I want to say first that a good friend, a colleague, a comrade, J.R. Fleming out of Chicago, once called me years ago to say on a Saturday morning and say, Rob, we got to stop calling ourselves human rights defenders. We are human rights enforcers. They exist, and we enforce those rights. So as you hear my tone and the cadence as I talk, you'll understand where a lot of that is coming from. So as you see, these are mechanisms and mandates that I am familiar with as an organizer, and probably the strongest relationship I have is with UN Rapporteurs, and I'll explain that as we go along, but I've also have a relationship with working groups, right? People of African descent. We're in the decade of people of African descent. I've worked with the working group on arbitrary detention, use of mercenaries, the right to development, and corporate responsibility is a big one because I work internationally and understanding transnational corporations and what their effect is on communities around the world. So when you talk about the special rapporteurs on the right to adequate housing, there have been 4 so far. Maloon Kathari is on my left. Raquel Rolnick, who came to the U.S. on an official mission, is on the right. Leilani Farhoff, who I probably have the strongest bond with, just finished her mandate in 2020, and now it is Balakrishnan and Rajagopal who has assumed that position. They generally serve, each term is 3 years. All of them so far have served 2 terms each. Raquel Rolnick came to the U.S. on an official mission in 2009, October 2009. And when I say official mission, it means the State Department signed off on it, right, to investigate housing injustice in the U.S., right? She was receiving information, or the High Commissioner's Office was receiving information around housing injustice in the U.S., and when social justice groups reached out, we reached out to Raquel, and she came on an official mission. She visited 7 U.S. cities, L.A., Chicago, New Orleans, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, the home of the Oglala Lakota Sioux. She went to an indigenous community. She was in L.A., if I didn't say that already, so several, and Pine Ridge, Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. So here's her visiting homeless youth in Chicago. We also had her visit individuals who were complaining about housing injustice in New York City. She actually went on a tour, a walking tour with us on a Saturday morning around New York City to visit folks who were complaining to their local governments, complaining to state governments, and complaining to federal governments to no avail, that they weren't getting an answer. They weren't getting any answers, or they weren't being responded to. But now this UN representative is coming to hear our stories. So we held a series of town hall meetings, but every state she went to, every city she went to, we made the visits look exactly the same. This is relevant because I opened up with J.R. Fleming. This is a picture of Cabrini Green in Chicago, one of the public housing, when they first started to destroy public housing in New York. I've always been fascinated by Cabrini Green. I don't know if any of you know who the singer-performer Curtis Mayfield is. He grew up in Cabrini Green, and for me to go to Cabrini Green and JR to point out that was Curtis Mayfield's house, it had a personal effect on me. So I've always been passionate about organizing around public housing. Raquel would always insist that I and other members of the community come to the General Assembly. The General Assembly is taking place right now in New York City, and she said, you have a voice, you're from the community, and she would demand that I be there and that I bring along people from the community. One of the greatest interactions I ever had with a guy from the World Bank making a point about housing and the financial of housing at the World Bank. And Raquel is kicking me under the table. I expect your response. That is not what you believe. You need to speak up. And that's, she was a motivator like that. So I've always appreciated that fact. You're not supposed to have favorites amongst people, like the professor's not supposed to have a favorite student. Leilani Farhoff holds a special place in my heart. Leilani would always say to me, Rob, get me away from First Avenue. First Avenue in New York City is where the UN is located. Take me into the community. I want to be involved in the community. I want the community to connect to the UN. This is her speaking into the new school. I happen to teach at the new school in a radical urbanization program there. But it was bringing her to the new school and having her meet students. So interacting with academia and the community was always important. Here she is in Brook Park in the Bronx, New York, one of the poorest census tracts in the country, but Raquel wanted to go there. So during the UN High-Level Political Forum in 2018, as part of UN Habitat and the Sustainable Development Goals, we actually went into Brook Park, which was a park which was claimed back by the community and turned into an urban farm. And she enjoyed herself. There she is speaking to folks in Brook Park, very passionate. And when I pointed out that that's the UN rapporteur, their mouths dropped open. That's a UN rapporteur dressed in shorts? And yeah, that's the rapporteur, right? So it was very cool. And Leilani never had a problem with going into the community. Again, you see folks from all over the world are sitting in Brook Park on this particular Saturday afternoon. And here, like, this work doesn't only happen locally, it happens globally. Who you see up on the screen now to my left is Sabu Sakoti, the leader of Abashali, the shack dwellers movement in South Africa. Interesting story, post-apartheid South Africa, they have a constitution that guarantees the right to housing. They were promised housing by the ANC in 1996 and on. Folks weren't realizing that right and started taking over vacant property. The municipalities started tearing down those shacks, and hence they had the shack dwellers name. But getting into constitutional court, they actually won a decision in 2012. But the interesting thing is, some of us complained around the world to the High Commissioner's office, and 6 rapporteurs wrote a letter to the South African government demanding that they stop tearing down those shacks. It stopped for a while, but it just shows the power of collaboration and people working together around the world. Here, so what are the benefits of these relationships with UN rapporteurs? Well, there are mission reports. I'm holding up here Raquel's report from 2010. It was released in February 2010, which I still use as a tool in my toolbox for organizing. Leilani Farha wrote strongly worded letters to the U.S. government about the financialization of housing, and she wrote also directly to Blackstone, right? But it also gets the public engaged, saying the UN is holding your government accountable, right? And that gives people power, right? There's academic engagement. You saw me with Leilani Farha at the New School. And there's documentary films. I have a couple of films of Raquel's visit to the U.S. In 2009, we gave everybody cameras, and as she did those visits, we pulled all that film together and created a documentary called More Than a Roof, when Raquel was at Ogala Lakata Sioux in Pine Ridge saying, a home is more than a roof. It's a sense of community. It was really a special statement. Here, I actually had the pleasure of traveling to India with a student that I mentored at the New School. I went to her wedding, but folks in India got me into the community. And here I'm talking to the Housing Rights Land Network, women who are organizing around the right to housing in India. Very powerful exchange. I got to spend an afternoon with some incredible women. And then here, Carlos is a lawyer from Medellin, Colombia, that understands how we apply human rights. And he's saying, how do we challenge governments here in Colombia, Rob? What are you doing in the U.S.? So those types of exchanges are invaluable. Carlos is in Medellin, Colombia. Here is with labor in Brazil. These are the electrical workers union. I work with MAAB, which is a movement of people affected by dams in Brazil. They're building high numbers of electrical dams in Brazil and pushing people off land. And this is how labor supports social movements. Here are lawyers from Brazil, female lawyers who reached out to me and said, we want to understand how you apply human rights. We've heard you on YouTube. We've heard you at different places. I got to meet them. This is a slide that I'm in favor of. You're all law school students. I understand there are challenges, and you've been repeatedly told there are scales of justice in this world. I would argue that those scales are not balanced when it comes particularly to people of color and low-income people, right? But also, when you go into a courtroom, I'm not a litigator. I understand litigation. I say we are challenged by the folks in the black robes upholding a constitution that was created 250 years ago, but that constitution is not fair. It is written in good old boys language. I have a couple of constitutions up here that were written in recent times that seem to do a better job of distributing the law. So it's something I want you to walk away with. When I did the work of Take Back the Land, we would always end our talks with two scales, right? But the right of someone to live in a home outweighs the right of a landlord or a speculator to profit off said home. Something I want you to walk away with here. We will provide you with tools to change the world. It won't change before us, but hopefully you'll take these tools that we give you today and move on and make change. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rob, for that extraordinary overview, which I think really highlights so many things about the ways in which advocates in the US have rejected US exceptionalism, right, which has exempted itself from scrutiny by the international system. Advocates have also really pushed back on the fact that the US government doesn't recognize economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to housing,
That's right.
And has, also pushed back on the US government in centering the experience of those who are most affected by these policies, right, and bringing out the multiple intersectional discriminations that are experienced in these spaces. And I think final observation I really appreciated about your presentation was highlighting that a core function of engaging with supranational institutions is not just engaging with the UN, but the transnational activism and networking that comes out of that.
That's right.
And so thinking about the ways in which civil society builds these bonds in resistance to governments imposing the structural inequalities as well. Thank you for that extraordinary presentation. Jamil, we've got your PowerPoint presentation ready to go, and you have a clicker to your right.
And I will be using my screen to be close to the screen because I don't see the screen. So, here we go. Yeah. Well, thank you first for inviting us here. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's the first time in Durham, first time at Duke Law School. It's really amazing to be here, and it's a short visit, but we hope that we can build on that in the future. I've worked with Jane and Aya and Monica, and you have amazing professors to learn from and to connect with the larger human rights community. So thank you for the opportunity. So what I'm going to do is very short time. I think you said 10 to 12 minutes. So I was at more to 12.
Let's see how it goes, Jamil.
Yeah. So I mean, is that the one here?
No, this one. This one.
Okay.
What's behind
All
it?
right. Yeah.
I can do it as I watch you screen.
Okay. So I just want to start with really building on what Rob was saying about the history of using international institutions, international human rights bodies. There's been a long tradition, and I really like to start by that because it's not something that we started. Certainly, what we do is really build on the legacies, a really tradition of many Black leaders and Black-led organizations in the United States. At least this is how I come to this work, and I build the connections to other organizations that are willing to take that and take on. And so I start with really saying that it is a history of people trying to seek accountability internationally, particularly during the darkest days of this country. And Rob mentioned how the Constitution was formed, excluding Black people and treating them in a time when they were enslaved Black people in the country, and also other injustices, including excluding women and other marginalized people. And that has been something that has been not been taught, and now we see that there's attempt even to censor what's being taught about this part of history. But what people try to do over decades, particularly with the NAACP first appeal to the world, led by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1947, was really to tell the world what's going on here, to really seek world attention to the racial injustice that was happening in the United States, to Jim Crow laws, to racism, anti-Black racism in particular, and particularly lynching that was going on particularly in this part of the country, in the South. And I like to mention that because we don't really know, we don't learn about this important experience. I think this is one of the first kind of shadow report. If you hear about shadow report, this is one of the first shadow report to be submitted to the United Nations. And yet at the time, in 1947, the United Nations was only 2 years old. There was really no process to hear any human rights complaints or petitions. So the UN system said to W.E.B. Du Bois, with all due respect, we can't even take your petition. And there was really had to force it on the UN at the time, the Human Rights Division in New York, the attempt by the NAACP to say, pay attention to what's going on here, while the world is now starting with building on and learning from the lessons of the Holocaust and the atrocities that happened during World War II. There's serious issues that are happening here. There's a grave violation of human rights happening here. And this continued not only with W.E.B. Du Bois that got a lot of attention, and even New York Times covering it, but other organizations like the Civil Rights Congress publishing a petition called We Charge Genocide. And that is because the Genocide Convention was just been adopted by the United Nations. And for Black people in this country, what was happening for decades and centuries was a genocide, an attempt to eradicate an attempt to eliminate their ability to be themselves and their culture, their ability to be as people and as equal citizens. That fast track, because of short of time, we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but fast track to the recent history. summer of 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, we saw again the same, many organizations that have been working in the last 20 years, and I've worked with Rob very closely, as he mentioned, the UN mechanisms, on bringing what is happening in the United States to the UN and try to bring back what the United Nations says here to the United States, to policymakers, to educators, to youth, to university students, to try to enforce that, even though the United States does not have any human rights enforcement mechanism domestically. That is really, think about that. We don't have a single domestic human rights enforcement mechanism, certainly not on the federal level. We do have a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, but its mandate is civil rights, not a human rights. We do have state and local human rights commissions, but they don't have a broad human rights mandate. They're certainly underfunded, don't have the same. But there is a movement that is demanding to change that. And the same people who've been working on race discrimination, racial justice in the U.S., after George Floyd killing and seeing movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter protests all over the country, in fact, all over the world, had worked with victims of police violence in the United States and families to demand accountability. And the call was for a UN Commission of Inquiry to be established for the first time in the world, at the UN level, but looking specifically at what's happening in the US. And that's, again, I'm going to skip through a lot of the details, but what came out of that is a really phenomenal process. First of all, we got, after 2 years of pushing, just last year, a first time the United Nations had heard directly from victims directly impacted by police violence. George Floyd's brother, and I have a video that I will not show it, you can watch it online, addressing the UN Human Rights Council, and the first time that such address will be at the center, at the beginning of any debate. Usually civil society and directly impacted are at the end or the margin of those kind of debates. Mm-hmm. And second of all, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was influenced by this advocacy, by this movement. And the High Commissioner herself acknowledged that, especially in elevating the demand for reparation, which I want to conclude by in a couple of minutes, which I hope I still have.
You do.
For example, Mothers Against Police Brutality, one of the organizations that was founded by victims of police violence. Colette Flanagan, who her brother, Clinton Allen, was murdered by Dallas Police Department, took action and said, we are going to organize and we are going to demand domestic accountability as well as international accountability. She testified in a video statement because of COVID to the United Nations Human Rights Council, welcoming the creation of the first ever independent expert mechanism that will be focusing on racial justice and law enforcement. This mechanism, by the way, that was a compromise. The call was for a commission of inquiry for the US and one that will be global. Because of pressure by former colonial powers, again, it's the same dynamic that we've seen for decades. It was pushed to combine it into one that will be only one independent expert mechanism that will focus on all law enforcement and racial justice all over the world. And well, we're not going to stop there. This will be one of the ways that we think we can bring human rights home, because this mechanism will be visiting the United States hopefully next year. Just as you heard from Rob, it will have to meet with directly impacted communities and will have direct impact on the conversation and the debate on police accountability and divesting from police, in particularly shifting to alternatives to policing in particular. But moving quickly to the recent weeks, literally last month, over 70 civil society activists, including advocates who were themselves directly impacted people, traveled to Geneva to appear before the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that was created by the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This is a treaty, one of the oldest human rights treaties, was adopted in the mid-1960s. The United States, by the way, signed it in 66, but it took 3 decades for us to ratify it in 1994. And even when we ratified it, we told the world, well, there's a lot of things that we like about this, but we will not make it the law of the land, really, as it should be under our Constitution. One of the only few things that, that this Constitution, or maybe many things that got it right, but one of the few things that got it really right was that ratified treaties should be considered the law of the land. And yet, when it comes to human rights treaties, and that's something that hopefully you explore in your human rights classes, is that the United States every time makes reservations to render these treaties essentially not enforceable in the court of law, and in many ways not to influence what domestic law is. Unlike many other nations that do exactly that. That's exactly what's the purpose of these treaties, right? And yet what we try to do is to continue to demand that international accountability. And last month was exactly that. The UN committee heard from activists. It had received documents and reports that were submitted on all range of issues that impacting particularly minorities, racial and ethnic minorities. And it had a real impact not only on the committee members, but also on the U.S. delegation. And I want to emphasize that. The U.S. delegation that appeared before the committee of over 33 government officials from all agencies at federal level. They had also members from the office of the mayor of Atlanta. The mayor himself, actually Dinkins, was there, as well as the representative from the Attorney General of California. And we had particularly centered reparations as one of the overarching demand that was echoed by the Special Rapporteur on Racism in her report in 2019, echoed by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, echoed by the Permanent Forum, the UN Working Group on People of African Descent, but also the Decade for People of African Descent. And now that we have the Permanent Forum, centering reparations and particularly for the legacy of transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. So important to that. And what had happened is that during the meeting, during the time that we were in Geneva, the U.S. delegation invited advocates to meet with the U.S. government. This meeting was supposed to be 2 hours. It turned into a 4 hours meeting. We don't have time to hear the whole video. We asked the government to make it public, and it made it public. First time in such meeting, which was, I think it's a small victory. But I want you to hear, and I will stop there, what this advocate said to U.S. delegates as they were wrapping up the meeting. Can you click on the video?
It doesn't.
Oh.
Probably different versions.
All right. Okay. So we will not hear the.
We will distribute the link because it is an important link. It's fascinating. And before Jamil finishes, I just want to add that 2 students from the University of Miami, who I had the pleasure of mentoring, went to Geneva to report on the surge. So you guys can have a role in that also.
Yeah. What I wanted to share with you is a very moving, powerful testimony by Erica Nanton. She is a voting rights activist and racial justice activist from Chicago, who submitted a report on reparations to the committee and addressed the U.S. delegation in that special meeting that was held. We will share the PowerPoint, and you can see it because it's a long meeting, but I was able to start it right when she talks about what she expects from the U.S. delegation. She brings also not only the issue of reparations, she says everything that we have been calling for, everything that civil society has been calling for is part of the reparations. And she talks about the gun violence in Chicago, her hometown. She talks about voting rights and the promise of voting in participation in civic. And I thought it was one of them. I mean, others made incredible testimonies, but I wanted to leave you with that. But anyway, thank you for much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamil. I really appreciated many things about your presentation, but particularly anchoring us in the real history of the ways in which advocates in the United States have long engaged in international spaces as a form of pushing back on the gaps in domestic accountability. And I think, one part of the story that we do cover in our classes here at Duke Law, particularly my human rights advocacy seminar, is like really thinking about, the ways in which civil rights activists took a very full agenda into these spaces, including an economic, social, and cultural rights agenda into these spaces. And we're sort of pushed back from pursuing that by the US government, who was really concerned that would be considered to be aligned with the Russians and communism, right? And so thinking about the ways in which there's been a long and sort of multi-layered level of engagement with these spaces. And I definitely will return in Q&A to thinking through, what this last particular engagement with the third committee meant, in this broader integrated advocacy approach. So thank you for laying out that whole trajectory of actors. Professor Curry.
Thank you, everyone. And it's good to sort of build on what's already been said, because a lot of that is exactly what we at the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent will be speaking about And we're still a very new forum, but we certainly have quite a bit of groundwork already laid for us by civil society and also by a number of UN mechanisms. You've heard about the special rapporteurs, certainly by the third committee, as was just mentioned, the working group. There are a lot of mechanisms, to be sure. And so the question I always start to ask, and we're still answering ourselves as a committee because we are still fairly new, what will be the added value of having this permanent forum? And exactly builds on what you're saying, right? What have been the limitations? Why have we not been able to move this agenda forward? And where are those bottlenecks that the forum can take forward? And I think one of those is exactly providing a platform for voices of people of African descent to be heard and for civil society to engage in a very real way, to be heard in a real way on the international globe. I'm from the Bahamas, and I say to groups there and my students as well, and CARICOM colleagues, this is an opportunity for people of African descent and community-based organizations to be heard on the international level for their issues, their stories, their concerns, their challenges to be heard. And so I'm happy to be a part of the forum. The forum, as I said, is really very new. Be operationalized in August 2021, so just recently, and basically as a part of the UN resolution, General Assembly Resolution 75314, which gave us a mandate. Our main role is to consult, to hear, to listen, to civil society and to people of African descent globally, right? To provide a platform, as I said, for voices. And we're looking at human rights, for sure, but at lives and livelihoods, which has to do with economic, social, and cultural rights. I know in the US, the focus has tended to be when we see the US on the international arena, and I've been in the UN for some 24 years, the focus has been on civil and political rights. You're really good in the Human Rights Council, on the Human Rights Committee, in years, certainly with Gay McDougall again, in CERD and so forth, but the voices of the United States and the NGOs in the United States have been silent over the years in the economic, social, and cultural rights spaces in the UN. So it's good to have this opportunity in the forum to bring these issues forward. And of course, we'll be serving as an advisory body to the Human Rights Council and to the number of mechanisms that were mentioned as well. So we'll be really bringing the pieces together. I think that's the added value. In the UN, one of the challenges we have is we tend to work in silos. Very interesting work being done, oftentimes not coming together in the way that we want to see it coming together for the rights of people on the ground. Yeah? And that's who we work for. But it tends to get stuck sometimes in UN headquarters in Geneva, New York, between those silos. And I worked for quite a while on sustainable development. And how do we bring the human rights colleagues together with the development colleagues? And I can tell you the New York development colleagues are like, no, we don't want to do human rights. You're going to cost us not to be able to do the work that we want to do because they see rights in the context of accountability. And then the human rights colleagues are saying the same thing. We want people to be held accountable. Yeah. So, yes, we want development in this space, but only when we're talking about accountability. We don't want to just be, let's come around and sing together about what we can do, but we need to hold some people accountable, some states really accountable. So the forum, and I apologize, I don't have a PowerPoint for you. I will try to go through this in a way that will be easy for you to follow. But so we at the forum, we are 10 members, and 5 were elected, and the United States has a member, Justin Hansford, very excellent colleague, lecturer at Howard University, precisely, who brings a lot to the table. So we have 5 members elected by the General Assembly, and 5 appointed by the Human Rights Council. I'm from the Bahamas, and I'm among the 5 that have been appointed. And that was a very interesting opportunity to be appointed. There were about 60 different persons vying to be on that, so I feel very humbled and honored to have been selected. So 5 and 5, and I think it's quite a good number And the forum is asking for representation from different regions, which I think we've done successfully. We have members from Costa Rica, China, Kenya, Colombia, Sweden, Cameroon, Egypt, and St. Lucia. So I think, we have 2 Africans, maybe 3, depends on where Egypt places itself in the forum, certainly 1 from Asia. But what is interesting is that a significant number are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think this is crucial because a lot of African voices, and you mentioned that you've been doing work down in Brazil and Colombia and Costa Rica, those voices over the years have hardly been heard in the global arena. I've been working in the UNED, like I said, for many years, and you see these representatives from these countries, and you never see an African face. And you'd be shocked to know that there are 200 million people of African descent living in the Americas, quite a large number from Brazil. They are not seen, they are not heard on the global stage. So this is an opportunity for us. We are honored to have the first vice president, Black woman from Costa Rica to be on as a member of our forum. So we're really, really honored, and there's a lot of passion in this group. There's certainly representation of people of African descent. There's gender balance. We're 5 and 5, so we're meeting all those requirements that the UN is asking for. The mandate really it looks at 9 points that they want us to. I'm going to try to rush through these 9 points, so that not rush too much, but walk through quickly. That's a good one. Walk through quickly. And we'll have opportunity to discuss a little bit more. But as we go through some of the issues that you've raised already, particularly the point about reparations, comes up strongly, right? Although the mandate does not specifically refer to reparations, we interpret it that way already as an important element for us. So the first point they're asking us to do is to contribute to the full political, economic, social inclusion of people of African descent, right? And looking at how they can enjoy their full gamut of human rights. And one of the things that I jump right into this, because I think one of the things blocking that has been the issue of recognition, of reparation, of acknowledging past injustices, right? And I made a point a couple of weeks ago in a presentation I was giving that racism really is humiliating and difficult for people of African descent many times to speak about, because it's almost like it's a fatiguing situation. It lives in the cells of who we are. When we show up, you see our color before you know anything about us, and that immediately puts it in the category, right? So, and that's challenging, because sometimes you walk in a room and you want to be accepted as the person that you are, the full person that you are, all that you bring to the table, not just your color. And that's a challenge. I think we need to recognize that, first of all, racism is a thing. It is real. It's not imagined. It's not in our minds. It is very real. It is linked to the legacies of slavery and colonialism, right? The transatlantic trade in enslaved persons is very real. And there have been hundreds of years of discrimination and suppression that has resulted, even after emancipation. The survivors of the genocide continue to live with this issue. It's like, wow, hundreds of years. How can we break these chains? And CARICOM has a 10-point plan on reparations. And this is a very, very interesting document. And we've done a lot of discussion around this in the Caribbean. How do we get the colonizers, the enslavers, to take responsibility? What was interesting, and I said it to my class the other day, how recently do you think they were dealing with the finances for slavery? It's not hundreds of years ago. I think they just finished in 2015. 2015, when all of you were here, paying off the loans to former enslavers for their slaves that they lost at the end of slavery. 2015, the descendants of enslavers were still getting money. Wow. That's very real, right? When we look at a country like Haiti, they were made to pay years of reparations, right? And just indeed having to think just how can you ask a country to pay so much for such a long period, up until I think it was the 1940s, which is huge. We're talking about events that took place in 1800, by the way, 1700s. And so we're talking about them today. But then you say, we shouldn't be speaking, someone has said, oh, you shouldn't be speaking about colonialism. You shouldn't be speaking about reparations. Why do people want? We want reparations. We want justice. We want to be recognized. And I know I've gotten my 1 minute notice. I get kind of passionate when I speak about this. But just to say that a part of this is also for us to look at how we work with other mechanisms within the UN system. I mentioned that we work in silos. It's important that we get together on these issues. We have a number of mechanisms already working. Recommendations are out there in large numbers, specific to countries. The US has gotten a number of recommendations over the years, including to set up an independent expert mechanism to respond, also to respond to reparations. They've been asked to do that on more than one occasion. So how do we bring these recommendations together? And I think as a forum, we have to find a way to take this work forward, this excellent work, excellent recommendations. We have to move it forward. And that's going to be a big part of the work we do. I think one opportunity we have is the development of the Declaration on the Rights of People of African Descent. This is going to be crucial, right? Because we get a chance to write down, with the support of civil society, academia and others, what do we want to see? And hopefully this can be codified as something that actually holds states accountable beyond a declaration. We hope to see at some point a convention or treaty that would specifically speak to the rights of people of African descent. That's important for us. And we as a forum, although we've only been around for a couple of months so far, and we haven't even met officially yet, we've had several informal meetings, but we've already, these issues keep coming up. And we recognize that they cannot be denied. We talk about what happened in Durban and the extent to which people of African descent, that issue wasn't quite dealt with in Durban. And we need to look at that a little bit further. So the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, does that really speak to the needs? And can we build a little bit on that and build that out in the context of the upcoming declaration? The issues around cultural heritage, which I think is important. And I'm wrapping up just now. And I just want to end on this idea around data and the importance of data. We speak about it and we don't know whom we're speaking about. Usually when I say how many people we're talking about in the region, they're like, really? 200 million in this region? Yeah, that's quite a number. It's not a small number of persons, small number of it, but each individual life is a life. You know, and we need to think, and each individual among that 200 million ought to have his or her right respected, protected, and promoted, and fulfilled by their respective governments. I'm going to wrap up here just to say that, you know, we are looking to do this collectively with civil society. We have already invited inputs from civil society and academia so that you can send us some thoughts, some ideas, and what you would like to see in the declaration. And what does this mean for you moving forward? I will end there and just say thank you very much for the opportunity. Sorry, I'm rushing through.
No, and apologies, it's not to be it's a difficult position to rush any of you because the content is so extraordinarily important and informative. And I really appreciated you drawing out sort of the interconnectedness of the UN system on these questions. Sometimes when you're on the outside, it's hard to understand how much civil society engages in multiple spaces and uses those spaces, you know, to enhance protections against discrimination. I also really appreciated taking us through the focus on reparations, and I want to come back to that if we have time in the Q&A. I think it's been quite an important turn in US advocacy to be much more deliberate about the call for reparations and to call a comprehensive package of reparations too. In that regard. But I have many questions, but I'm more interested in opening the floor and giving students a chance to ask questions and to engage. When you ask a question, please just identify yourself and what year you're in, and then take advantage of the opportunity to engage with our experts that are here today.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I'm Gabby Levico. I'm a 3L here. I had a question for Mr. Robinson. I'm curious, when you talked about the different advocates who weren't getting traction at the local, state, or federal level, and then the UN, your special rapporteur came in to see their situation. Can you talk a bit about what ended up happening there? Does that then end up resulting in their situations improving? Does this sort of international stage provide more opportunities? And just hoping you can expand on that.
Sure. The best example of that, because we're limited at time, was Detroit. In 2014, we brought 2 UN rapporteurs who heard us asking for them to come, but they spent their own resources, which I found phenomenal. They couldn't get an official visit, and they reached in their pocket and they said, this is important, and we're going to go. So the mayor of Detroit wasn't listening when Detroit was in bankruptcy, and they were paying the emergency manager $1,000 an hour and started putting it on the backs of people who couldn't pay water bills, right? So people were telling how much water was affecting their lives, no access to water. And then there was a very important news conference at the end where the mayor of Detroit tried to hold a news conference, but Katarina de Albuquerque, who was a fierce rapporteur on water and sanitation, said, no, we already set up our press conference, and we want the voices of people of Detroit to be heard around the world. And I think the statements that both her and Leilani made at that time, that they've seen third world countries where their residents were treated better, really elevated that issue. It elevated it to the federal government and having conversations with the federal government to alleviate that problem. So we saw firsthand the effects. And what was real powerful was the 500 attendee town hall meeting that we held, where people got to speak to these representatives of the UN. And that was empowering for them, and conditions changed.
Olivia.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm doing so much for coming here today. You all kind of mentioned how much you work with civil society and the grassroots organization at the local level. And I was wondering, in pursuit of your goals, have you ever been in a situation where civil society might have conflicting ideas of what reparations and what the end goal should be, or what the priority should be, and if so, how do you deal with that?
If I can add on to that, I was interested in reading and looking at the advocacy that took place in Geneva, how a core focus is on addressing anti-Black racism and then also addressing other forms of racial discrimination that happen in the United States. And so how do those different processes get balanced or reflected on by civil society?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Okay. I think it's a really great question. Thank you for raising that, because in fact, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination covers race, ethnicity, color, and descent. It doesn't cover religion, by the way. It doesn't cover other grounds, but in the way that it's been interpreted by the committee and the way that it's been, also the way that's been advocated, that, you are really trying to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination and racism. And you heard, earlier from the professor about DAPA, the Durban Declaration on Plan of Action, which unfortunately got overshadowed by 9/11 and other political pressure not to make it a important public document, but it did really cover a lot of issues and areas that impacting many people, particularly marginalized communities and people of color across, including indigenous peoples. In fact, the CERD has also been traditionally one of the key treaty bodies, UN committees that have addressed indigenous self-determination rights, land rights, etc. Now, when it comes to issues of how to reconcile different objectives and goals, it's really a challenge because you bring people together, particularly civil society actors that have different backgrounds, different traditions, different interests and goals, and also lived experiences. And it's really hard always to say, oh, everybody's going to agree on one statement, and we're all going to speak in one language. That's not what actually happens or should happen. But what we try to do is we try to use that space, and it's very limited space. The UN doesn't open up very easily to civil society, by the way. It's an intergovernmental organization. It's built on governments that don't want necessarily to see human rights realized. They want to suppress human rights, particularly when it comes to issues like historic racial injustices. And what we do with these instances is we try to use some of these privileges that some of us have. The ACLU uses our privilege. Why? Because we are a big organization, resource organization that have status with the United Nations that can make video statements to the UN Human Rights Council rather than, and bring partners and people who are otherwise not being able to make those statements to the United Nations. We would use all of the resources that we have, other experiences, expertise to provide that to the larger coalition. And then we try to create a space that is as fair and equitable, and more importantly, centering those that are directly impacted. Whenever we have those occasions, and they're very rare in the US context because we only ratified three treaties. That's why Rob has been telling you about the special rapporteurs. You don't have to ratify the Economic and Social Cultural Rights Convention in order to address housing discrimination, right? Because the special rapporteur comes, and then when you do that, you create a space for people to address them in their own language, in their own experiences. And what I found as a lawyer, as an expert in human rights, is that the best people who come usually with the best solutions are the people who are directly impacted. Because they live that day in, day out. They have the solutions that they see that we do, and they are not heard, as you say. They are invisible, they're marginalized, they're pushed by design not to be part or not to have a seat at the table. So by creating these spaces, the UN elevates and amplifies these voices. And what we hope is that it will influence the debate, it will influence policy making, it will make changes. And those changes are not easy. One last sentence is about the third outcome. We had 30 pages long concluding observations on all range of racial discrimination in the United States. But they're already, and they are, you can look at them online and read them yourself. Already changes already been happening because of what we did in Geneva. The EPA has not sent monitors to the Cancer Alley in Louisiana, but just after the committee raised this issue, the environmental racism, the impact on particularly black people in this area, had the EPA send monitors the first time, right? CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, and their partners who testified before the committee led to that change. The Department of Homeland Security, when they were deporting Cameroonian, when they heard what the civil society actors, Baji and Haitian Bridge Alliance, raised the issues of racism in the context of immigration, the DHS was ready to sit down and talk about some of the people who were deported and how can they rectify some of the situation. We heard from other, and that's what just I'm telling you examples of the last few weeks. So there are certain tangible things. The U.S. government itself coming to the UN and says, we're going to look into the possibility of creating a national human rights institution. The president supports studying reparations. Now we got to push him after the midterms on issuing an executive order to establish a commission that will study reparations that will have an impact on other initiatives that are already happening from California to other small localities and even non-governmental entities. So there is an impact that we have to connect all these things together. It's not a one shot, and it's not a one bite of the apple. We would have to keep doing it, and that's what this continuity that you see. This has over time an impact of changing both legal culture, policies, and hopefully also people's attitude toward issues of race and discrimination and racism.
Would you like to reflect on, Rob and Professor Curry, on that question and make any sort of final observations in the remaining minutes?
I'd just like to add to what you said, and well said, by the way, just to say that the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, one of the things we're going to be looking at is exactly that. We recognize that people come to the table with different perspectives, different lived experiences, different understanding of the issues. Even the experts, and even within the UN system, just to be clear, there's not necessarily one agreed position that they all have as they come to the table. I think what we want to do in the forum is provide that opportunity for us to discuss, for us to hear the voices. And as I said from the very beginning, and as you mentioned as well, we want to hear from people, the grassroots persons working on the ground. These are the people whose voices we need to hear. Because we could be in those big buildings in New York and Geneva, completely, distant and not really understanding the core issues of a homeless person, right? And we need to hear from them. And this is what we're hoping the forum will do, provide exactly that opportunity for voices to be heard. And one of the things we hope to do, and I'm going to say it here, but I'm sure our member states would not be happy, but we want to give the floor, first of all, to civil society, non-governmental organizations. They're always as an aside, right? And so we have side events involving them and so forth. We want the forum itself to be about them, to be a space where they are heard, and to give a limited time to member states, because it's usually member states, the other way around, right? And so I think that when we do this, we begin to have an opportunity to hear from them. The more we hear each other, I think the more likely we are to come closer to some sort of an agreement, to some sort of livable arrangement that we can take the issue forward. The idea is to speak about it, to engage on it. It took hundreds of years to get us here. It's going to take some time. I understand with the Indigenous Forum, the negotiations took quite some time, right, for the declaration on Indigenous persons. I think it took 11 years or something like this. We're hoping that the Declaration for People of African Descent does not take
much longer. The UN DRIP,
exactly.
The UN DRIP took 3 decades.
Exactly. So we're hoping that we can move this issue along, building on that experience, and certainly because we don't want to wait another 30 years before we can think about having reparations for people of African descent. It's gone on long enough, and I mean, the impact of racism and racial discrimination is not a single dimensional thing. It permeates in the lives of people of African descent at every single level, in education, in health, in housing, and we think about in the justice system, as you mentioned, the UN report, and I had a chance to work on that initially as well. It is something that is important. When we first got this story with George Floyd, we even at the UN wanted to take to the streets, and we were told we couldn't. And I'm like, hey, why not? I'm Black. I want to go out there and demonstrate, and I want my daughter, who's 11, to also understand that she should stand up for her rights as well, and stand up when it's wrong, and say this is wrong and point it out. But we had to fight even within the UN to say, hey, we as an organization, we have to stand up for this issue as well, not just this speaking to states through treaties and conventions and so forth, but to show by example that we believe in these issues and we will stand up against it. And I was happy that the Secretary General ultimately did speak about it and did talk about the importance of reparations, and the former High Commissioner also did mention for the first time, and I was so pleased, the issue of reparations. So there's more and more talk about that, and I'm hoping that we're getting on the same pathway in terms of how we move this issue forward. Thank you.
Great. We have just about 1 minute, Rob. I know you haven't had a chance to respond to that question. Did you want to add any?
Just a quick one for Olivia, how it practically played out in New York. So we had the UN Working Group on People of African Descent in a town hall meeting, the City University of New York Graduate Center, January 2015. And when the question came up of reparations and what it looks like, it turned into a huge debate. I was working with a colleague that Jamil knows very well, Nahal Amani, from the Center for Constitutional Rights, and we had to end it because